He was already turning away when a tiny hand grabbed his coat. The hallway went silent as the little girl looked up at the most dangerous man in the city and whispered, "Sir." My mom didn't wake up. Jack Michelle froze because the apartment she was pointing to belonged to the man who owed him money, and whatever was inside had just changed the debt forever. If this story pulled you in, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss what's coming next. I've got another unforgettable story dropping tomorrow. And while you're here, jump into the comments and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing our community from all around the world. Alright, let's get back into it. The snow fell quietly in the dim corridor of the Riverside apartment complex as Jack Michelle climbed the stairs to the 4th floor. At 34, he'd grown accustomed to these late-night collections, the negotiations that kept his empire running, the debts that always came due. His dark hair was cut short and neat, tattoos visible at his neck where his black coat fell open, ink creeping up toward his jawline like shadows given permanent form. The long wool fabric moved around him like a second skin, expensive and dark as the reputation that preceded him everywhere he went. Success in his world had come early for Jack, but it had cost him something he'd stopped trying to remember he'd lost. Empathy, hesitation, the ability to see people as anything other than assets or liabilities. Tonight was supposed to be simple. Collect from Victor Hale, make an example if necessary, move on to the next name on the list. The rhythm of his life had become mechanical, predictable, empty in ways he no longer let himself notice. He reached apartment 407, Victor Hale's name barely visible on the tarnished number plate beside the door. Light seeped through the gap at the bottom. Music played faintly inside something old, crackling, desperate to fill silence. Jack knocked once. Sharp. Final. The sound of scrambling came from inside. Furniture scraping. Whispered curses. Then the door opened to reveal Victor Hale, mid-30s, unshaven, eyes red-rimmed and glassy with something that might have been alcohol or fear or both. Sweat beaded on the man's forehead despite the cold seeping through the hallway behind Jack. Winter air reaching through the building's entrance like grasping fingers. "Mr. Michelle?" Victor stammered, one hand gripping the doorframe, knuckles white. I can explain. I just need a little more." 3 days, Jack said, his voice quiet, controlled, carrying the weight of finality that made grown men flinch. Not a negotiation. A statement of fact. "You have 3 days, Victor." Victor nodded frantically, words tumbling out in a cascade of excuses Jack had heard 100 times before from 100 different mouths. Lost opportunities. Bad luck. Money coming any day now. The same tired script desperate men read from when they realized the bill had come due and their pockets were empty. Jack let him talk. There was a strategy to it. Let them expose their weakness. Let them show you exactly how afraid they were. Weak men were useful when they were desperate, and Victor Hale was drowning in desperation, gasping for air that wouldn't come. Jack absorbed the information. He needed no money, no prospects, no way out, and mentally cataloged his next move. 3 days would pass. Victor would still have nothing, and then decisions would need to be made. The kind of decisions that kept Jack's world running smoothly, kept fear sharp and respect absolute. He turned to leave, his mind already moving to the next appointment, the next debt, the next negotiation, in an endless chain of nights that all looked the same. That's when he felt it, a small hand gripping the edge of his coat. Jack stopped, froze completely. In his line of work, unexpected touches meant weapons, meant ambushes, meant someone had gotten too close. His body tensed, ready for violence. But when he looked down, violence was the furthest thing from what he found. A little girl stood in the doorway behind Victor, no more than 5 years old. She had light brown hair pulled back from her face, strands escaping to frame features that were pale in the hallway's harsh fluorescent light. She wore a blue-gray coat with a yellow scarf wrapped around her neck, the fabric bright against the muted colors of everything else. A teal backpack hung from one shoulder, and her small brown boots were scuffed and worn, laces dragging on the ground. But it was her eyes wide, frightened, holding on to courage like it might slip away any second that made Jack's world tilt sideways. "Sir," she whispered, her voice barely audible above Victor's continued rambling behind her. The man hadn't even noticed she'd appeared, too caught up in his own spiral of excuses. "Sir." My mom didn't wake up. The words hit Jack like a physical blow, like the first time he'd taken a knife to the ribs, sudden, sharp, stealing breath. Victor went silent mid-sentence. The hallway seemed to contract, walls pressing in. Snow continued drifting through the open entrance 4 floors below, cold air rising through the stairwell. But Jack didn't notice any of it. He crouched slowly, his knees meeting the cold concrete floor, bringing himself level with the child. The position was vulnerable, something Jack never allowed himself to be. But he moved without thinking, instinct overriding years of careful self-preservation. Up close, he could see she'd been crying. Her cheeks were tracked with dried tears, her lower lip trembling with the effort of not crying again. Her small hand remained locked on his coat, fingers twisted in the expensive wool like it was the only solid thing left in her world. "What do you mean she didn't wake up?" Jack asked, his voice losing its edge, becoming something else entirely. Something he didn't recognize as his own. "Where is she?" The little girl pointed behind Victor, into the apartment's dim interior, where shadows gathered in corners and doorways. "Inside, on the floor by the couch. I tried shaking her, but she won't open her eyes." Her voice cracked, fear bleeding through every syllable. "I got scared. She always wakes up when I shake her. Always." Jack's mind shifted years of calculating risk and violence, focusing on a different kind of equation entirely. He looked past Victor into the apartment, saw the shadows and the unnatural stillness beyond, saw the way Victor's body blocked the doorway. Not like a concerned guardian, but like someone trying to hide something terrible. "What's your name?" Jack asked, bringing his attention back to the child. "Olivia," she whispered. "Olivia Coppins." "Okay, Olivia." Jack stood slowly, and Olivia's hand remained locked on his coat, small fingers holding on with desperate strength. "I'm Jack. Can you show me where your mom is? Can you take me to her?" Olivia nodded, then looked up at him with an expression that made something in Jack's chest, something he thought had calcified into stone years ago, crack open like ice breaking under pressure. "You'll help her?" Olivia asked, her voice so small, so full of hope and terror mixed together. "You promise?" Jack looked at this child who had grabbed a stranger's coat, who had chosen him out of pure desperate chance, who was trusting him with everything she had because she had no other choice. "Yes," Jack said. "Not a promise, a fact. Show me where." Jack had made a career out of reading people, the micro-expressions that betrayed lies, the body language that screamed guilt, the tremor in a voice that meant someone was about to run. But Olivia Coppins wasn't trying to deceive him. Every word from her mouth carried the weight of pure, terrified honesty. Victor finally seemed to notice his daughter standing there. Jack crouched at her level, and something flickered across the man's face. Not concern, not parental instinct. Something closer to panic mixed with calculation, the look of someone whose carefully constructed lie was about to collapse. "Olivia, go back to your room," Victor said, his voice tight. "This doesn't concern you." "She said her mother won't wake up," Jack replied, not taking his eyes off the child. "That concerns me. It's nothing. Hannah, she's sleeping. Heavy sleeper. Olivia gets confused sometimes." Victor's words came too fast, tumbling over each other like dominoes falling. "Kids, you know? They don't understand." "I'm not confused," Olivia said, her small voice cutting through her father's rambling with unexpected strength. Her fingers tightened on Jack's coat. "Mommy's hurt. I saw the blood." The temperature in the hallway seemed to drop 10 degrees. Jack rose slowly to his full height, his body unfolding with the controlled precision of a blade being drawn from its sheath. He looked at Victor Hale, really looked at him now, and saw what he'd missed before in his own routine indifference. The scratches on Victor's forearm, partially hidden by his sleeve. The way he held his right hand curled slightly, knuckles swollen. The spatter of something dark on his collar that might have been wine but probably wasn't. "Step aside," Jack said quietly. "Look, this is a family matter. You came for money, right? I'll get you the money. I'll figure something out, but this is private, between me and my wife." Jack didn't repeat himself. He simply looked at Victor with the same expression that had made hardened criminals confess to crimes they hadn't committed, that had made enemies surrender territory without a shot fired, that had built his reputation one terrified heartbeat at a time. Victor stepped aside. Olivia immediately moved past her father, her hand still gripping Jack's coat, leading him forward like a small, determined guide through territory she knew too well. Jack followed, his senses cataloging everything: the apartment's layout, exit points, potential weapons, the smell of old food, and something else underneath it. Something metallic and wrong. "It's okay, sweetheart," Jack said softly to Olivia, the words foreign in his mouth. When was the last time he'd spoken with gentleness? When had he last needed to? "Just show me where she is, nice and slow." Olivia nodded, her braid swinging against her back as she led him past a cramped kitchen where dishes sat piled in the sink, past a living room with furniture that had seen better decades, toward a narrow hallway. Her backpack bounced against her small frame with each step, and Jack wondered absently why she was wearing it. Had she been planning to leave? To run? Smart kid. They reached the living room, and Jack's trained eye immediately found her Hannah Coppins, lying motionless on the floor beside a sagging couch. She was on her side, one arm bent beneath her, dark hair spilled across the worn carpet. Even from the doorway, Jack could see the unnatural angle of her body, the stillness that wasn't sleep. "Stay here," Jack told Olivia, his voice firm but not harsh. He gently extracted his coat from her grip, felt the reluctance in her fingers as they finally released him. "Right here, okay? Don't move." "Is she sleeping?" Olivia whispered, her eyes huge in her pale face. "Is she just sleeping?" Jack didn't answer. He couldn't. Not yet. He crossed the room in 3 strides, dropping to one knee beside Hannah. Up close, the damage was unmistakable. Her face was swollen on one side, a dark bruise blooming across her cheekbone and jaw. Dried blood crusted at the corner of her mouth. Her breathing was shallow, barely visible. Each inhalation a weak flutter. Jack pressed 2 fingers to her neck, found a pulse thread-thin and erratic, but there, still alive, for now. His mind, honed by years of violence and calculation, immediately assessed the situation. Head trauma, possibly severe. Time was critical. Every second mattered. He pulled his phone from his coat pocket, dialed 911, without looking. His eyes cataloging every injury, every sign of trauma. "I need an ambulance," he said when the operator answered, his voice clipped and precise. He rattled off the address, the apartment number, described Hannah's condition with clinical accuracy that came from seeing too many bodies in too many states of damage. Unconscious female, visible head trauma, weak pulse, shallow breathing, possible internal injuries. Behind him, he heard Victor moving in the doorway, heard Olivia's small gasp. "How long has she been like this?" Jack asked without turning around, keeping his attention on Hannah, watching the barely perceptible rise and fall of her chest. Silence from Victor. Jack finally looked back, and the expression on his face made Victor take an involuntary step backward into the hallway. "How long?" "I don't know," Victor stammered. "Maybe an hour? We had an argument. She fell. It was an accident." "People don't get bruises like this from falling," Jack said, his voice devoid of emotion now, flat as a blade's edge. "Try again." Olivia spoke before her father could answer, her small voice cutting through the tension like a knife through silk. "He gets loud," she said, staring at her father with something that looked like old, tired knowledge. "And then Mommy sleeps a lot. She always wakes up after. But tonight she didn't. I waited, and she didn't wake up." The words hung in the air, heavy with implications that made Jack's jaw tighten. In the distance, sirens began to wail, growing closer. The ambulance was coming. Help was coming. But Jack had already made 3 decisions in the space of those few seconds. 1. Hannah Coppins would live. He'd make certain of it. 2. Olivia would be protected, whatever that required. 3. Victor Hale had just become something worse than a debtor. He'd become a problem that needed solving. The apartment had a smell Jack recognized from a dozen crime scenes he'd rather forget copper and fear and violence trying to hide itself under cheap air freshener. He stayed kneeling beside Hannah, one hand hovering near her shoulder, not quite touching. In his world, he'd learned to avoid leaving evidence. But this wasn't his crime scene. This was something else entirely. "The ambulance is coming," Jack said to Olivia, keeping his voice steady, calm, the same tone he used when negotiating deals that could turn fatal if someone panicked. "Your mom's gonna be okay. But I need you to do something for me." Olivia nodded, her small face solemn, too old for her years. Children who lived with violence learned to read rooms the way Jack read balance sheets, looking for danger, calculating survival. "Go pack a bag," Jack said. "Some clothes, things you need." "Can you do that? Are we leaving?" Hope cracked through her voice like sunlight through storm clouds. "Yes," Jack said, though he hadn't consciously decided this until the word left his mouth. "You're leaving." Olivia disappeared down the hallway, her footsteps quick and light, and Jack heard a door close. Smart kid. She'd been ready for this conversation, had probably imagined it 100 times, probably prayed for it. Jack turned his attention back to Hannah, studying the visible injuries with the clinical detachment that had served him well over the years. The bruising on her face was fresh, hours old, not days. But there were older marks too, faded yellow-green shadows along her collarbone visible where her shirt had shifted. A pattern, a history. This hadn't been the first time. It had just been the worst. The sirens grew louder, close enough now that Jack could distinguish the ambulance's wail from the general city noise. 2 minutes, maybe less. He needed to make a decision about what story he'd tell when they arrived. The truth was complicated. The truth involved a crime boss visiting a debtor, a child grabbing his coat, a domestic situation that had gone critical. The truth would involve police reports, questions, investigations that Jack's world couldn't afford. Behind him, Victor hadn't moved from the doorway, rooted there like a man watching his execution, and not knowing if he should run or beg for mercy. Jack could feel the man's presence, could hear his breathing rapid, shallow, scared. Good. He should be scared. Mr. Michel, Victor started, his voice cracking. Look, I know how this appears, but don't. Jack didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. Don't say another word. Victor's mouth snapped shut. Jack stood slowly, his full height and presence filling the small living room. He moved toward Victor with measured steps, each one deliberate, until he stood close enough that Victor pressed himself back against the hallway wall, trying to create distance that didn't exist. Here's what's going to happen, Jack said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. In his experience, whispers carried more threat than screams. The ambulance is going to arrive. You're going to tell them exactly what happened, that you hit your wife, that she's been unconscious for over an hour, that you were too much of a coward to call for help yourself. But I'll be arrested, Victor stammered. I'll lose everything. You've already lost everything, Jack replied, and something in his tone made Victor's face go pale. You lost it the moment you put your hands on her. You lost it when your daughter had to choose a stranger over her own father because she knew you wouldn't help. The sirens were right outside now, the red and blue lights flashing through the apartment windows, painting the walls in alternating colors of emergency. The debt, Victor said desperately, grasping at the only leverage he thought he had left. I still owe you money. You need me too. The debt is the least interesting thing about you now, Jack interrupted. In fact, consider it paid in full. Victor blinked, confusion joining the fear in his expression. What? You heard me? The money you owe me? Gone. Forgiven. You no longer owe me cash, Victor. Jack leaned in slightly, his voice dropping even lower. Now you owe me something much more valuable. Your complete cooperation. Your silence. Your understanding that whatever happens next, you don't mention my name, my presence here, or anything about why I came to this apartment tonight. And if I do? Jack smiled, but there was nothing warm in it, nothing human. It was the smile that had made men sign over businesses, that had ended partnerships and started wars, that had built his reputation one nightmare at a time. Then I'll consider it a breach of contract, Jack said simply. And you know what I do with people who break contracts. Heavy footsteps pounded up the stairwell outside, paramedics coming, help arriving, the world intruding on this moment of suspended violence. Olivia emerged from the hallway, a small purple duffel bag clutched in both hands, her backpack still on her shoulders. She looked at her father, then at Jack, making a choice that no child should have to make. She walked to Jack's side. The apartment door burst open, paramedics flooding in with equipment and urgent questions, their professional efficiency filling the small space with controlled chaos. Jack stepped back, letting them work, one hand resting lightly on Olivia's shoulder as she pressed against his side. I'm her father, Victor was saying to one of the paramedics, his voice taking on a tone of concerned panic that might have been convincing if Jack hadn't heard what came before. We had an argument. Things got heated. I didn't mean... Sir, step back, the lead paramedic ordered, already assessing Hannah's condition with swift, practiced movements. We need space to work. Jack watched them prepare Hannah for transport, watched them secure her neck, check her vitals, radio the hospital with information that painted a grim but not hopeless picture. Severe trauma, possible skull fracture, but alive, still fighting. Olivia's small hand found his, fingers wrapping around two of his larger ones with surprising strength. Is Mommy going to die? She whispered, so quietly only Jack could hear. Jack looked down at this child who had stopped him in a hallway, who had trusted him with the most important thing in her world, who was now looking up at him with eyes that held too much fear and too much hope. He thought about lying, thought about comfortable platitudes and empty reassurances. Instead, he told her the truth. I don't know, Jack said, but I'm going to make sure she has every chance to live, and I'm going to make sure you're safe while she fights. Olivia nodded, accepting this, and held his hand tighter as they carried her mother out into the snow. The hospital emergency entrance blazed with fluorescent light against the dark winter night, a beacon of sterile efficiency that swallowed the ambulance whole. Jack followed close behind in his own car. Olivia strapped into the passenger seat beside him, her purple duffel bag clutched in her lap like a lifeline. She hadn't spoken during the drive, just stared out the window at the passing streetlights, her small face reflected in the glass, pale, drawn, years older than it should have been. Jack pulled into the emergency parking lot, killed the engine, and sat for a moment in the sudden silence. He should leave. Every instinct honed by years of survival told him to drop Olivia at the entrance, make an anonymous call to child services, and disappear before complications multiplied. He had enough problems without adding a traumatized child and her dying mother to the list. But when he looked at Olivia, saw the way she held herself together through sheer force of will, saw the trust she'd placed in him back in that hallway, a trust he'd done nothing to earn, leaving became impossible. "Come on," Jack said quietly, opening his door. "Let's go check on your mom." The emergency department was controlled chaos nurses, moving with purposeful speed, doctors barking orders, machines beeping in rhythms that meant life continuing or life failing. The smell of antiseptic couldn't quite cover the underlying scent of blood and fear. Jack approached the reception desk, Olivia's hand in his, and the nurse looked up with the practiced exhaustion of someone 12 hours into a 16-hour shift. "Hannah Coppins," Jack said before she could speak. "Came in by ambulance maybe 10 minutes ago. Head trauma." The nurse typed rapidly, eyes scanning her screen. "Are you family?" Jack hesitated for only a second. "I'm the one who called 911. This is her daughter." The nurse's expression softened when she looked at Olivia, some of the professional distance melting away. "She's being evaluated now. Are her parents here? We need consent for treatment. Her father's on his way." Jack lied smoothly. Victor was probably still at the apartment, either talking to police or running. Jack didn't particularly care which. "I'm staying with Olivia until he arrives. There's a waiting area down that hall," the nurse said, pointing. "Someone will update you as soon as we know more." Jack nodded his thanks and led Olivia to the waiting room, a depressing space with plastic chairs, outdated magazines, and a television playing some late-night show no one was watching. They sat, Olivia's small form disappearing into the chair beside him, her feet not quite touching the ground. "Mr. Jack?" Olivia's voice was small, tentative. "Just Jack," he corrected gently. "You don't need the mister." "Jack," she tried again, testing the name in her mouth. "Why did my daddy hurt Mommy?" The question landed like a physical blow, direct and devastating in its simplicity. Jack had negotiated million-dollar deals, had stared down men twice his size who wanted him dead, had built an empire on his ability to navigate complex and dangerous situations. But this question from a 5-year-old girl left him momentarily speechless. "I don't know," he finally said, choosing honesty over comfort. "Sometimes people do bad things. Sometimes people we're supposed to trust hurt us." "Did your daddy hurt your mommy?" Jack's jaw tightened. His own childhood was a locked room he never opened, a past he'd buried under years of carefully constructed present. But Olivia was looking at him with those two old eyes, and somehow lying to her felt like a betrayal worse than any he'd committed in his criminal career. "Yes," Jack said quietly. "He did." Olivia nodded, as if this confirmed something she'd suspected. "Did she die?" "No. She left. Took me with her." Jack paused, memories he hadn't accessed in years surfacing unwanted. "It wasn't easy, but we survived." "Will Mommy survive?" "I'm going to do everything I can to make sure she does," Jack said, and realized with some surprise that he meant it completely. The debt he'd come to collect had transformed into something else entirely, a debt he owed now, to this child who'd grabbed his coat and asked for help when the world had taught her that help rarely came. Movement at the waiting room entrance made Jack look up. Victor Hale stood in the doorway, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Olivia. Relief and fear mixed on his face in equal measure. "Olivia, baby," Victor said, moving toward them. "Are you okay? I was so worried." Olivia pressed closer to Jack's side, her small body rigid with tension. Victor noticed, and something flickered across his face. Hurt, anger, recognition that he'd lost something irretrievable. "Mr. Michel," Victor said, his voice taking on a pleading quality. "Thank you for staying with her. I can take it from here." Jack didn't move. "Can you?" "She's my daughter. And Hannah is your wife," Jack replied, his voice soft but carrying an edge that made Victor stop his approach. "How's that been working out?" Victor's face flushed. "This is a family matter. I appreciate your help, but—" "He gets loud," Olivia said suddenly, her voice small but clear in the sterile waiting room. "And then Mommy sleeps. That's what happens." The words hung in the air, damning in their childish simplicity. "Olivia, you don't understand," Victor started. "Adults have complicated." "I understand," Olivia interrupted, and the certainty in her voice cut deeper than any accusation Jack could have made. "I always understand. Mommy tells me it's not my fault, that it's just how things are sometimes. But I don't like it when you get loud. And I really don't like it when Mommy sleeps and won't wake up." A nurse appeared in the doorway, clipboard in hand, her expression professional but grave. "Family of Hannah Coppins?" All three of them turned toward her. "She's stable for now," the nurse continued. "But she has a severe concussion and a skull fracture. We're moving her to ICU." The next 24 hours are critical." She paused, her eyes moving between Victor and Jack, trying to determine relationships and authority. "The police have been notified. They'll want to speak with whoever witnessed the incident." Victor went pale. Jack stood slowly, his decision made in the space between one heartbeat and the next. "I witnessed it," Jack said calmly, the lie rolling off his tongue with practiced ease. "I was visiting the apartment when it happened. I'm happy to provide a statement." Victor stared at him, understanding dawning Jack was taking control of the narrative, shaping the story that would determine what happened next. And Victor, trapped by his own crimes and Jack's implications, could only watch as the most dangerous man in the city decided his fate with nothing more than a few quiet words and a little girl's hand in his. The police arrived 20 minutes later, 2 uniformed officers with the tired eyes of people who'd seen too much domestic violence and not enough justice. They separated Victor from Jack and Olivia, taking statements in different corners of the waiting room, while nurses moved between them like referees in a fight nobody wanted to watch. Jack sat with the older officer, a broad-shouldered man named Patterson, whose wedding ring was worn thin from years of twisting it during difficult conversations. Olivia remained pressed against Jack's side, silent, listening to every word. "So you were at the apartment when the assault occurred?" Patterson asked, pen poised over his notepad. "I arrived during an argument," Jack said, the lie forming with careful precision. Years of misdirection had taught him that the best lies stayed close to the truth. "The door was open. I heard shouting. By the time I got inside, Hannah Coppins was already on the floor. Victor was standing over her. "And your relationship to the family?" "I'm a business associate of Mr. Hale," Jack said smoothly. "I had an appointment to discuss financial matters. When I arrived and saw the situation, I called 911 immediately." Patterson's eyes narrowed slightly. "Business associate? What kind of business?" "Investment consulting," Jack replied without hesitation. The lie was one he'd used 100 times, legitimate enough on the surface to discourage deeper investigation. "Mr. Hale owes my firm a significant sum. I was there to discuss repayment terms." The officer made notes, his expression neutral but thoughtful. Jack could see him processing the information, trying to determine if there was more beneath the surface. There always was. But Patterson was smart enough to know that sometimes you accepted the statement in front of you, especially when it gave you enough to act on. "And the child?" Patterson glanced at Olivia. "She was present during the assault? She found her mother unconscious," Jack said, his hand unconsciously moving to rest on Olivia's shoulder. "She's the one who sought help. If it wasn't for her courage, Hannah Coppins would likely be dead right now." Patterson's expression softened marginally. "Brave kid." He flipped his notepad closed. "We'll need a formal statement downtown. But this is enough for now. Based on what you've told me and the medical evidence, we'll be placing Mr. Hale under arrest for aggravated domestic assault." Across the waiting room, Victor's face went white as the second officer moved toward him, handcuffs already in hand. "Wait," Victor said, his voice rising. "This is a misunderstanding. We can work this out. Hannah wouldn't want—" "Sir, you have the right to remain silent," the officer began, and Victor's protests dissolved into the standard recitation of Miranda rights that Jack had heard more times than he could count, though usually from the other side. Olivia watched her father being handcuffed with an expression that broke Jack's heart in ways he didn't know were still possible. Not satisfaction, not fear, just a terrible, weary acceptance. This was her normal. Violence and consequences and adults who failed her. "What happens to her?" Jack asked Patterson quietly, nodding toward Olivia. "While the mother's in ICU? Child Protective Services," Patterson replied, pulling out his phone. "They'll place her in emergency foster care until family can be located, or the mother recovers enough to resume custody." "No." The word came out harder than Jack intended. Patterson looked up sharply. "Excuse me?" Jack forced his voice back to calm, professional tones. "I'm willing to take temporary custody. As I said, I'm a business associate of the family. The child knows me. She trusts me. Foster care would be traumatic after what she's been through tonight." "That's not how it works, mister." Patterson checked his notes. "Mr. Michel, there are procedures, background checks, home evaluations. We can't just hand a child over to—" "I understand procedures," Jack interrupted smoothly. "But it's nearly midnight. You're looking at hours of paperwork to process an emergency placement, and this child has been through hell. Let me keep her tonight. Run your background checks. If something disqualifies me, I'll cooperate fully with alternative placement tomorrow." Patterson studied Jack with the calculating gaze of someone trying to decide if he was looking at a Good Samaritan or something else entirely. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the hospital's ambient noise and the sound of Victor being led away in handcuffs, still protesting his innocence to anyone who would listen. "I'll need your full legal name, address, and identification," Patterson finally said. "And you don't leave the city. If CPS needs to place her elsewhere tomorrow, you make yourself available." "Of course," Jack said, already pulling out his wallet, handing over a driver's license that was technically legitimate, even if half the information on it was carefully curated fiction. Patterson took down the information, made a phone call to someone at Child Services, and after 10 more minutes of paperwork and warnings, he handed Jack a temporary custody form that gave him 24 hours before the system would require more permanent solutions. "Thank you," Jack said, meaning it. Patterson just nodded, but his eyes said he'd be watching, checking, making sure this unusual arrangement didn't turn into another nightmare for a kid who'd already lived through too many. When the police finally left, taking Victor with them in the back of a patrol car, the waiting room fell into exhausted silence. Jack looked down at Olivia, who had remained quiet through all the adult negotiations about her future, as if she'd learned that children's voices didn't carry weight in these decisions. "Are you hungry?" Jack asked. Olivia shook her head. "When's the last time you ate?" She thought about it, her small face scrunching with concentration. "Breakfast, maybe? Daddy said we'd have dinner," but then he got loud. Jack's jaw tightened. "Come on. Hospital cafeteria's still open. You need food." They walked through the sterile corridors, Olivia's hand in his, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders, her purple duffel bag hanging from Jack's other hand. He caught their reflection in a darkened window, a tattooed man in an expensive black coat, now stained with Hannah's blood at the shoulder where he'd carried her, and a small girl with a braid and 2 old eyes. They looked nothing alike. They had no legal connection. By every reasonable measure, Jack Michel should have walked away from this situation hours ago. But when Olivia looked up at him and asked, "Can we see Mommy after we eat?" with such fragile hope, Jack realized that walking away had stopped being an option the moment a small hand had grabbed his coat in a dim hallway. "Yes," Jack said. "We'll check on her, I promise." And Jack Michel, who broke promises as easily as bones, meant every word. The cafeteria was nearly empty at this hour, just a handful of night shift workers hunched over coffee and a doctor asleep at a corner table, still wearing his surgical cap. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in the kind of harsh brightness that made exhaustion visible on every face. Jack bought Olivia a grilled cheese sandwich, apple juice, and a chocolate chip cookie that looked like it had been sitting under the heat lamp since dinner service. She ate mechanically, small bites that she chewed thoroughly, her eyes distant, trauma eating. Going through motions because an adult told her to, not because her body remembered hunger. Jack's phone buzzed in his pocket. He checked the screen, 3 missed calls from Roman, his second in command. The man who handled the details Jack didn't want to think about, who kept the machine running when Jack's attention was elsewhere, which it had been for hours now. Jack stood, moving a few feet away but keeping Olivia in his line of sight. He returned Roman's call, already anticipating the conversation. "Where the hell have you been?" Roman's voice came through tight with controlled frustration. "You were supposed to be back 2 hours ago. Constantine is waiting on the shipment approval. And the lawyers need your signature on the Brighton deal before midnight or we lose." "Handle it," Jack interrupted quietly. Silence on the other end. Then, carefully, "Handle what? Exactly?" "All of it. Approve the shipment. Sign the Brighton deal yourself. Forge my signature if you need to. I'm not coming in tonight." "Boss, what's going on?" Roman's tone shifted from frustrated to concerned. "You never miss appointments. You never delegate signature authority. Is there a problem?" Jack looked at Olivia, watching her push pieces of grilled cheese around her plate with mechanical precision, and wondered how to explain that everything had changed because a child had grabbed his coat. "I need you to pull information on Victor Hale," Jack said instead of answering. "Everything. Bank records, employment history, criminal background, known associates. I want to know who this man is down to his shoe size. The deadbeat from Riverside? Boss, he's a nobody. Small-time debt, not worth the resources. He put his wife in the ICU," Jack said, his voice flat. "He's been beating her in front of their 5-year-old daughter. So when I say I want everything on Victor Hale, I mean everything that will bury him so deep he never sees daylight again." Another silence, longer this time. Roman had worked for Jack for 8 years, had seen him make decisions that ruined lives and ended careers, but there was something in Jack's voice now that Roman had never heard before. "Understood," Roman finally said. "I'll have a complete file by morning. But boss, this kind of personal involvement, it's not like you. People are going to notice. They're going to wonder why you care about some random domestic case. Let them wonder, Jack said, and ended the call. When he returned to the table, Olivia had managed to eat half the sandwich and most of the cookie. Color was returning to her pale cheeks, though her eyes still carried that haunted, faraway look. "Can we see Mommy now?" she asked, her voice small but hopeful. Jack nodded. "Let's go check." The ICU was on the 4th floor, a hushed sanctuary of beeping machines and whispered urgencies. The nurse at the station looked up as they approached a young woman with kind eyes and a name tag that read Jennifer. "We're here to see Hannah Coppins," Jack said. "This is her daughter." Jennifer's expression softened when she saw Olivia. "Room 412. But honey, your mom is sleeping right now. She has a lot of machines helping her, and it might look scary. Are you sure you want to go in?" Olivia nodded with the solemn certainty of someone who'd already seen worse things than hospital equipment. Jennifer looked at Jack, some question in her eyes he couldn't quite read, but she stood and led them down the corridor to room 412. 15 minutes, she said quietly. "And if she shows any signs of distress, you need to leave immediately." The room was dim, lit only by the glow of monitors that tracked Hannah's heartbeat, blood pressure, oxygen levels, all the numbers that determined whether someone lived or died. Hannah lay in the bed, her face swollen and bruised, a breathing tube taped to her mouth, IV lines running from both arms. The steady beep of the heart monitor was the only sound besides their footsteps. Olivia stopped just inside the doorway, her small body going rigid. Jack knelt beside her, bringing himself to her level. "It's okay," he said softly. "She looks different, but it's still your mom. And see that screen?" He pointed to the heart monitor. "That beeping means her heart is beating. She's alive, Olivia. She's fighting." Olivia took a tentative step forward, then another, until she stood beside the bed. Her small hand reached out, hovering over her mother's hand, afraid to touch as if contact might break something fragile. "You can hold her hand," Jack said gently. "It won't hurt her." Olivia's fingers wrapped around her mother's, and for the first time since Jack had met her in that hallway, tears began sliding down her cheeks. Not dramatic sobs, just quiet, exhausted crying, the kind that came from a well too deep to empty quickly. "I'm sorry, Mommy," Olivia whispered. "I'm sorry I left you alone with him. I'm sorry I couldn't help." Jack felt something crack open in his chest, something he'd sealed shut years ago when he'd learned that feeling things in his world was a liability. But watching this child apologize for adult failures, watching her take responsibility for violence that should never have touched her, made him understand something fundamental about power. He'd spent years believing power was control over territory, over money, over men who feared his name. But real power, he realized now, was choosing what to protect. Real power was standing between innocence and violence and refusing to move. "Olivia," Jack said quietly, "what happened to your mom isn't your fault. It was never your fault. And it's never going to happen again." She looked up at him with those two old eyes. "How do you know?" "Because I'm going to make sure of it," Jack said. And in that moment, he made a decision that would change the trajectory of his entire life. "Your father is never going to hurt your mother again. Or you. Or anyone. I promise you that. But he'll get out," Olivia said with the weary certainty of someone who'd seen this cycle before. "He always gets out. And then he says, 'Sorry,' and Mommy believes him, and then he gets loud again." Jack looked at this 5-year-old child who understood the criminal justice system's failures better than most lawyers, and made another promise, one he knew he could keep, because it lived in the shadows where he operated best. "Not this time," Jack said. "This time is different." He didn't tell her how. Didn't explain the phone calls he'd make, the pressure he'd apply, the way he'd ensure Victor Hale's life became a cautionary tale whispered in the underworld. You could steal from Jack Michel. You could even try to kill him, if you were brave and stupid enough. But you couldn't hurt children and women and expect to walk away whole. The machines continued their steady beeping. Hannah's chest rose and fell with mechanical assistance, and Olivia stood holding her mother's hand while Jack Michel, crime lord and collector of debts, stood guard over them both, transformed from predator to protector by nothing more than a small hand grabbing his coat in a snowy hallway. Outside room 412, night deepened toward morning, and Victor Hale sat in a holding cell downtown, not yet understanding that his real punishment hadn't even begun. They left the ICU at 2:47 a.m., when the night shift nurse gently but firmly insisted that Olivia needed rest. The child had fallen asleep in the chair beside her mother's bed, her small hand still wrapped around Hannah's fingers, her cheek pressed against the edge of the mattress. Jack had carried her out, her backpack clutched against his chest, her head resting on his shoulder in a trust that felt heavier than any burden he'd ever carried. The waiting room had emptied since they'd last been there, just an elderly man dozing in a corner chair and a young couple holding hands. waiting for news that might never come. Jack chose seats away from the others, settling Olivia across 2 chairs, her purple duffel bag serving as a makeshift pillow. She stirred slightly, her eyes opening halfway. "Is Mommy still sleeping?" "Yes," Jack said quietly. "But she's safe. The doctors are watching her." "Are you leaving?" Fear cracked through the question, sharp and immediate. "No," Jack said, surprising himself with how easily the promise came. "I'm staying right here." Olivia's eyes closed again, and within seconds her breathing evened out into the deep rhythm of exhausted sleep. Jack watched her for a long moment, this small person who had upended his entire world in the span of a few hours, then pulled out his phone. 3 a.m., the hour when nothing good ever happened, when bad decisions were made and worse ones were justified. He had 17 missed calls now. 6 from Roman, 4 from his lawyer, 3 from business associates who didn't appreciate being stood up, and 4 from numbers he didn't recognize, probably competitors sensing weakness, circling like sharks who'd caught the scent of blood in the water. Jack Michel didn't miss appointments, didn't break his word, didn't let personal matters interfere with business. His reputation was built on reliability, on being exactly where he said he'd be, doing exactly what he said he'd do. Until tonight, he texted Roman, "Clear my schedule for the week. Personal matter. I'll explain later." The response came within seconds. "Boss, you don't have a personal life. What's going on?" Jack stared at the message, at the truth of it. Roman was right. Jack's life was his business. He had no family, no relationships that extended beyond utility, no attachments that couldn't be severed if they became inconvenient. He'd built that isolation deliberately, layer by layer, until he'd become exactly what he needed to be: untouchable, unmovable, alone. And then a child had grabbed his coat. "Things change," Jack typed back. "Handle it." He silenced his phone and leaned back in the uncomfortable plastic chair, letting his eyes close for just a moment. He didn't sleep, couldn't afford to, not in public, not with Olivia depending on him, but he let himself rest in that space between wakefulness and unconsciousness, where thoughts became untethered. "Excuse me, sir." Jack's eyes opened immediately, his body tensing before his conscious mind registered the threat level. A woman stood before him, mid-40s, wearing a blazer over jeans, a county ID badge clipped to her belt. Her expression was professionally neutral, but her eyes were sharp, cataloging everything. "I'm Rebecca Torres, Child Protective Services," she said quietly, glancing at sleeping Olivia. "Officer Patterson contacted me about the temporary custody arrangement. I need to ask you some questions." Jack stood slowly, moving away from Olivia so their conversation wouldn't wake her. Torres followed, pulling out a tablet and stylus. "How do you know the Coppins family?" she asked, diving straight into interrogation mode. "I'm a business associate of Victor Hale," Jack said, maintaining the fiction he'd built earlier. "I was at their apartment on business when I discovered Hannah unconscious. Olivia sought my help." "And you've had previous contact with the child?" "No. Tonight was the first time we met." Torres made notes, her stylus moving across the screen. "Mr. Michel, I'm sure you understand this is highly irregular. We don't typically place children with strangers, regardless of the circumstances. Officer Patterson indicated you were persuasive. But I need to conduct my own assessment." "I understand," Jack said calmly. "What do you need to know?" "Let's start with your living situation. Where do you reside?" Jack provided his address, a penthouse in the financial district, legitimate on paper, purchased through enough shell companies to make tracing ownership complicated but not impossible. "Marital status?" "Single." "Other children in the home?" "No." "Employment?" "I own an investment consulting firm." The lie rolled off his tongue smoothly, backed by documentation that would hold up to surface-level investigation. Torres continued her questions: income, criminal record, references, lifestyle, building a profile that would determine if Jack was suitable to keep a traumatized 5-year-old for even 24 hours. Jack answered each question with the careful precision of someone who'd spent years constructing identities that could withstand scrutiny. But then Torres asked something he wasn't prepared for. "Why?" Jack blinked. "I'm sorry? Why do you want to take responsibility for this child?" Torres looked up from her tablet, her professional mask slipping slightly to reveal genuine curiosity. "You don't know her. You have no legal obligation. You could have called us hours ago, walked away, gone back to your life. Instead, you're here at 3 in the morning, sleeping in a waiting room chair, negotiating to keep custody of a stranger's daughter. So I'll ask again. Why?" Jack looked back at Olivia, curled up on the chairs, her face relaxed in sleep in a way it probably hadn't been for months, years, maybe. He thought about the question she'd asked him earlier. Did your daddy hurt your mommy? He thought about the little boy he'd been once, before he'd learned to turn fear into power and vulnerability into armor. The boy who'd watched his mother pack their things in the middle of the night, who'd learned that sometimes running was the only form of survival available. "Because someone helped me once," Jack said quietly, the truth surprising him as much as it did Torres. "When I was not much older than she is. Someone saw what was happening and decided it mattered. Decided I mattered." He paused. "Olivia grabbed my coat tonight and asked for help, and I can't." His voice caught slightly. "I can't be the kind of man who walks away from that." Torres studied him for a long moment, her sharp eyes searching for deception and apparently not finding it. She made one final note on her tablet. "I'm approving 72 hours, she said finally. "You'll need to bring her to our office Monday morning for a full evaluation." "And Mr. Michel?" She held his gaze. "If I find out you're not who you say you are, if this child is harmed or endangered in any way, I will bring down every resource the state has on you. Are we clear?" "Crystal," Jack said. Torres handed him a business card. "My direct line. If anything changes, if the mother's condition worsens, if the father makes contact, if Olivia shows signs of distress, you call me immediately." "Understood." She left, her footsteps echoing down the empty corridor, and Jack returned to his seat beside Olivia. The child stirred, her hand reaching out unconsciously, and Jack let her fingers wrap around his wrist. 72 hours. 3 days to figure out what happened next. To navigate a system he'd spent his career avoiding. To somehow protect this child while maintaining the empire that was probably crumbling in his absence. His phone buzzed with another message from Roman. "Constantine walked. Says you're not reliable anymore. Brighton deal fell through. We're losing ground, boss. Whatever you're doing, it better be worth it." Jack looked at Olivia's sleeping face, peaceful for the first time since he'd met her, and typed back a single word. "It is." Then he silenced his phone again, leaned his head back against the wall, and kept watch over a little girl who'd stopped a crime lord in a hallway and asked the one question he couldn't refuse to answer. "Will you help?" The answer, it turned out, was yes, even if it cost him everything. Morning light filtered through the hospital windows, pale and gray, carrying no warmth. Jack had been awake for 36 hours straight, surviving on vending machine coffee and the adrenaline that came from operating outside his comfort zone. Olivia slept against his side, her head on his lap, her breathing steady and peaceful in a way that made Jack's chest tighten with something he didn't have a name for. His phone had stopped buzzing around 5 a.m. Either Roman had given up trying to reach him, or the business had imploded entirely. Jack found he didn't particularly care which. "Mr. Michel?" Nurse Jennifer stood at the waiting room entrance, her expression carefully neutral in the way medical professionals learned when delivering news that could go either way. Jack gently shifted Olivia, trying not to wake her, but her eyes opened immediately, the hypervigilance of a child who'd learned to sleep lightly, always ready for danger. "Is it Mommy?" Olivia asked, fear and hope tangled in her voice. "She's awake," Jennifer said and smiled. "She's asking for you." Olivia was on her feet instantly, backpack forgotten, moving toward Jennifer with desperate speed. Jack followed, his body protesting the movement after hours in a plastic chair, but the physical discomfort was distant, unimportant. They walked down the ICU corridor in silence, Olivia's hand finding Jack's automatically, holding on with that grip that had become familiar over the past few hours. At room 412, Jennifer paused. "She's still very weak," she warned. "The breathing tube came out an hour ago, but talking is difficult. Don't expect too much too fast." Olivia nodded solemnly, and they entered. Hannah was awake, her brown eyes open and tracking their movement. The swelling in her face had gone down slightly, but the bruising had deepened to ugly purples and yellows. Without the breathing tube, Jack could see her trying to form words, her lips moving carefully around what must have been significant pain. "Baby," Hannah whispered, the word barely audible but carrying an ocean of emotion. Olivia released Jack's hand and moved to her mother's bedside, tears already streaming down her small face. "Mommy, you woke up. You woke up." "I'm here," Hannah managed, her hand lifting slowly to touch Olivia's cheek. "I'm so sorry, baby. I'm so sorry." Jack stayed back, giving them space, watching this reunion that he had no part in but had somehow made possible. He should feel out of place, should feel like the intruder he technically was. Instead, he felt something else, a fierce protectiveness that had no logic behind it, no rational explanation. Hannah's eyes found him over Olivia's head, and Jack saw her trying to place him, confusion mixing with wariness and something that might have been gratitude. "Who?" Hannah's voice cracked, and she winced. "This is Jack," Olivia said quickly, turning to gesture at him. "He helped us, Mommy. He saved you. When you wouldn't wake up, I found him, and he called the ambulance, and he stayed with me all night, and he promised Daddy wouldn't hurt us anymore. Hannah's eyes widened, processing this information, and Jack saw the fear creep in the learned response of someone who'd spent too long being controlled. I'm not a threat to you, Jack said quietly, stepping closer but maintaining distance. I was at your apartment last night on business with Victor. Olivia came to me for help. I called 911, stayed with her while you were in surgery. That's all. Victor, Hannah whispered, and something like panic crossed her face. Where is he? Is he in custody? Jack said firmly. He was arrested last night for assault. He can't reach you here. You're safe. Hannah closed her eyes, and tears slid down her bruised cheeks. Not relief exactly, something more complicated. The tears of someone whose cage door had opened but who wasn't sure she remembered how to fly. I should have left, Hannah said, her voice breaking. I should have taken Olivia and left years ago. But he always said, he always promised it would get better, that he'd change, and I wanted to believe. You don't have to explain, Jack interrupted gently. I understand. Hannah looked at him, really looked at him, and Jack wondered what she saw. The tattoos at his neck, the expensive coat now wrinkled and stained, the hardness in his eyes that years of violence had carved there. She should be afraid of him. In some ways, she should be more afraid of him than Victor. Why are you helping us? Hannah asked, the same question Torres had posed hours earlier. You don't know us. What does Victor owe you that makes this worth your time? Jack glanced at Olivia, who was watching him with those two old eyes, waiting to hear his answer. Victor owed me money, Jack said honestly. I came to collect. That debt's forgiven now. What he owes me instead is something different, his cooperation, his silence, his understanding that you and Olivia are under my protection until you're stable enough not to need it. Protection, Hannah repeated, and Jack heard the skepticism. Like the mob? Jack's lips twitched in something that wasn't quite a smile. Something like that. And what do you want in return? Hannah's voice was weak, but her eyes were sharp. Men like you don't do favors without expecting payment. Smart question, Jack acknowledged, but the truth is simpler than you think. Your daughter grabbed my coat and asked for help. I said yes. Everything after that is just following through on that promise. Hannah studied him for a long moment, then looked at Olivia, who had moved back to holding her mother's hand, her small body radiating relief and exhaustion in equal measure. Olivia trusts you, Hannah said finally. She doesn't trust easily, especially not men. I know, Jack said. So either you're very good at lying to children, or you're actually sincere. Hannah's eyes held his. I'm not sure which terrifies me more. I'm not asking you to trust me, Jack said. I'm just offering help. Practical help. A safe place to stay when you're discharged. Resources to relocate if that's what you want. Legal assistance. Whatever you need to make sure Victor never gets near you or Olivia again. Why? Hannah whispered, the question carrying more weight than one word should hold. Jack thought about his answer carefully. He could tell her about his own childhood, about the violence he'd witnessed and survived. He could tell her about the little boy who'd learned to turn pain into power. He could explain that somewhere along the way, to becoming the man he was now, he'd lost something essential, and maybe helping them was about finding it again. Instead, he told her the simplest truth. Because I can, Jack said. Because I have the resources and the means and the will to make sure what happened to you doesn't define the rest of your life. And because your daughter is 5 years old and she shouldn't have to be this brave. Hannah's tears came harder now, and Olivia climbed carefully onto the bed beside her mother, wrapping small arms around her with infinite gentleness. Thank you, Hannah whispered, looking at Jack. Whatever happens next, thank you for not walking away. Jack nodded, not trusting his voice, and stepped back toward the door. They needed time together, mother and daughter, without his presence shadowing the room. But before he could leave, Olivia called out. Jack? He turned. You'll come back, right? Olivia's voice was small, uncertain. You won't disappear? Jack looked at this child who'd stopped him in a hallway, who'd changed the trajectory of his entire life with one desperate question, and made a promise he knew he'd keep even if it cost him everything he'd built. I'll come back, Jack said. I promise. And for the first time in his adult life, Jack Michelle walked out of a room feeling like he'd gained something instead of taken it. Jack left the ICU and walked straight into a problem. Roman stood in the hospital lobby, his arms crossed, his expression caught somewhere between fury and concern. At 6'3" with a shaved head and shoulders that barely fit through doorways, Roman cut an imposing figure. People moved around him instinctively, sensing danger even when he stood perfectly still. Finally, Roman said when he spotted Jack. I've been calling for 12 hours straight. Do you have any idea what's happening while you're playing Good Samaritan? Not here, Jack said quietly, nodding toward the exit. They walked outside into morning air that was cold enough to bite. Snow had stopped falling, leaving the city covered in gray slush that would turn to ice by nightfall. Jack pulled out a cigarette, a habit he'd quit 2 years ago, but suddenly needed again, and lit it with hands that were steadier than they should have been. Talk, Jack said. Roman didn't waste time. Konstantin walked, took his business to the Petrov organization. The Brighton deal collapsed. Lawyers won't work with someone who ghosts signature meetings. 3 of our mid-level distributors are asking questions about your reliability. And Mitchell, Roman paused. Mitchell is making noise about leadership concerns. Jack took a drag, let the smoke fill his lungs, exhaled slowly. Mitchell, his oldest partner, the man who'd helped him build this empire from nothing. If Mitchell was questioning his leadership, others would follow. Let him make noise, Jack said. Roman stared. Boss, Mitchell controls 40% of our East Side operations. If he decides you're compromised, if he starts making moves against you, then I'll handle Mitchell, Jack interrupted. Same way I've handled every other challenge in the last 10 years. This isn't like you, Roman said. And for the first time, Jack heard genuine worry in his second's voice. You've never put anything ahead of business. Never let personal matters interfere. What's happening here? Who is this kid? Jack looked back at the hospital, at the building where a woman was recovering from violence that should have killed her, where a little girl was finally sleeping peacefully because she knew her mother would wake up. Her name is Olivia, Jack said. She's 5 years old, and last night, she grabbed my coat and asked me to help save her mother's life. And, Roman waited. That explains one night, boss. It doesn't explain why you're still here, why you've cleared your schedule, why you're letting everything we've built start to crumble. Jack finished the cigarette, dropped it, crushed it under his heel with more force than necessary. When I was 7, Jack said quietly, speaking words he'd never said aloud before, my father put my mother in the hospital, broke her jaw, 3 ribs, gave her a concussion that affected her vision for the rest of her life. We lived in a building not unlike the one Olivia lives in. Thin walls, neighbors who heard everything. And you know how many people helped us? How many people called the police, offered assistance, gave a damn that a woman was being beaten to death while her son watched? Roman said nothing. 0, Jack continued. Not one person. We were invisible. Our suffering was entertainment or inconvenience, but never something worth intervening in. My mother eventually got herself out, took me with her, but it was years too late. The damage was done. I'm sorry, Roman said, and meant it. But boss, you can't save every abused kid in this city. You can't rebuild your childhood by... I'm not trying to save every kid, Jack interrupted, his voice hard. I'm trying to save this one. The one who came to me. The one who trusted me when she had no reason to. At what cost? Roman asked bluntly. You're bleeding money, losing territory, showing weakness to every competitor who's been waiting for an opening. The empire you built, our empire, it's going to collapse if you don't get your priorities straight. Jack looked at his second in command, this man who'd followed him for 8 years, who'd helped him build something from nothing, who deserved an explanation that made sense. My priorities are straight for the first time in my life, Jack said. Everything I've built, Roman, the money, the power, the fear, we generate, what's it for? What's it worth if I'm still the same as every person who looked the other way when I needed help? It's worth survival, Roman said. It's worth not being weak, not being prey. I'm not prey, Jack said quietly, dangerously. I've never been prey, but I'm not going to be a predator who walks past a child asking for help just because it's inconvenient for business. Roman was silent for a long moment, processing this, trying to reconcile the boss he knew with the man standing before him. So what do we do? Roman finally asked. About Mitchell, about the territory we're losing, about the questions people are asking. Jack pulled out his phone, sent a single text to Mitchell. My office. Tonight, 8 p.m. Come alone. We remind everyone why they follow me in the first place, Jack said. Not because I'm always available, not because I never take personal time, but because when I make a decision, it's final. And anyone who wants to question that can do it to my face. Roman's expression shifted slightly, relief mixing with concern. And the kid? The kid and her mother are my responsibility now, Jack said. That's non-negotiable. You'll adjust schedules accordingly, move meetings that can be moved, cancel what can be canceled, handle what you can handle. I need 3 days, maybe 4, until Hannah's stable and I can set them up somewhere safe. And then, Jack thought about Olivia's question. You'll come back, right? You won't disappear? And then I figure out how to do both, Jack said. Run the business and keep the promise I made to a 5-year-old girl. If that's impossible, if those two things can't coexist. He paused. Then I'll make a choice. You're serious, Roman said, reading the truth in Jack's expression. You'd actually walk away from everything we've built for some kid you met 12 hours ago. Jack met his second's eyes, and whatever Roman saw there made him take an involuntary step back. She grabbed my coat, Roman. She looked up at me with the same eyes I saw in the mirror when I was 7 years old. And she asked me to help. Jack's voice was quiet but absolute. So yes, if it comes to that choice, I'm walking away. Roman absorbed this, his jaw working as he processed the implications. Then we make sure it doesn't come to that, Roman said finally. We shore up the business, put down the challenges, make it work. Because boss, with all due respect, the world needs men like you doing what you do. And if helping this kid makes you more human, maybe that's not weakness. Maybe that's what we've been missing. Jack felt something release in his chest that he hadn't realized was tight. Handle Mitchell, Jack said. Let him know I'm not backing down, not showing weakness. This is expansion, not contraction. I'm adding responsibility, not abandoning what I've built. And if he doesn't see it that way? Jack's expression went cold. Then Mitchell's going to discover what happens when people mistake evolution for weakness. Roman nodded and turned to leave, but paused. For what it's worth, boss. I hope it works out. The kid, the mom, all of it. You deserve something in your life besides violence and spreadsheets. Then he was gone, disappearing into the morning crowd, leaving Jack alone with his cigarettes and his choices. Jack's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. This is Rebecca Torres, CPS. Just checking in. How's Olivia doing? Jack typed back. She's with her mother. Hannah woke up an hour ago. They're both doing well. The response came quickly. Good. Remember, Monday morning evaluation. Don't be late. Jack pocketed his phone and headed back inside. Back toward the ICU where a little girl was probably asking when he'd return. Back toward a life he'd never planned but couldn't walk away from. The Empire could wait. Olivia couldn't. Jack sat in his office at 7:45 p.m., the city sprawling below him through floor-to-ceiling windows that cost more than most people's houses. He'd left the hospital 2 hours ago, promising Olivia he'd return in the morning, promising Hannah he'd start making arrangements for their future. Nurse Jennifer had finally convinced him that sleep was necessary, that he couldn't protect anyone if he collapsed from exhaustion. So here he was, back in the world he'd built, waiting for a confrontation that would determine whether he could have both lives or would have to choose. Mitchell arrived at exactly 8 p.m. The older man was in his 50s, silver-haired, wearing a suit that probably cost $5,000. He'd been with Jack since the beginning, had helped establish the networks and relationships that turned ambition into empire. Jack, Mitchell said, settling into the chair across from the desk without waiting for invitation. A power move. A signal that he considered them equals, not boss and subordinate. Mitchell, Jack replied calmly. Roman said you had concerns. Concerns is putting it mildly. Mitchell leaned back, his expression neutral but his eyes calculating. You disappeared for 36 hours, missed critical meetings, lost us the Constantine contract and the Brighton deal. People are starting to wonder if you've lost focus. I haven't lost anything, Jack said. Then where were you? Jack considered his answer. He could lie, maintain the mystique, feed the rumor mill something that reinforced his reputation, or he could tell the truth and see what happened when power met honesty. I was at the hospital, Jack said, with a 5-year-old girl whose mother I saved from being beaten to death. Mitchell blinked, clearly not expecting that answer. You're joking. Do I look like I'm joking? You stopped everything we've built to play hero for some random kid? She wasn't random, Jack said quietly. She came to me. Asked for help. I gave it. Mitchell laughed, but there was no humor in it. And now what? You're going to adopt her? Start a charity? Jack, this business doesn't allow for weakness, and compassion is weakness. No, Jack said, his voice hardening. Fear is weakness. Isolation is weakness. Building an empire and having nothing in it worth protecting, that's weakness. This is sentiment talking. You'll realize. I'm not asking your permission, Jack interrupted, his tone going cold enough to frost the windows. I'm informing you of reality. Hannah and Olivia Coppins are under my protection. I'll be allocating resources to ensure their safety and future stability. If that impacts quarterly profits, so be it. Mitchell stood, his face flushing. The board won't accept this. I won't accept this. There is no board, Jack said quietly. There's me and people who work for me. That includes you, Mitchell. It's always included you. I built half this empire. And I'm grateful for that, Jack said. But gratitude doesn't make us partners. You want to challenge my leadership? Go ahead. Call a meeting. Make your case. See how many people follow you when you're asking them to choose between me and… What exactly? Your objection to me helping a child? Mitchell's jaw worked, fury and calculation warring in his expression. This isn't about the kid, Mitchell said finally. This is about you changing the rules. We built something based on predictability, on ruthlessness, on never letting personal feelings interfere with business. You're threatening everything by evolving. Jack finished. By becoming something more than a calculator in an expensive suit. You're afraid, Mitchell. Not of me losing focus, but of me gaining perspective. Perspective. Mitchell laughed bitterly. You think compassion makes you stronger? I think. Jack said slowly, standing. That real power isn't controlling everything. It's choosing what to protect. And I choose to protect Olivia and her mother, even if that means disappointing you. Mitchell stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head. You've changed, Jack. And not for the better. Don't be surprised when others notice and decide they want different leadership. Then they're welcome to try taking it from me, Jack said calmly. But Mitchell, if you're going to challenge me, do it now. To my face. Because if you walk out that door and start making moves behind my back, if you try to undermine me while pretending loyalty, there won't be a second warning. The threat hung in the air between them, sharp and absolute. Mitchell's hands clenched into fists at his sides, and for a moment Jack thought he might actually throw a punch. Instead, the older man turned and walked toward the door. This isn't over, Mitchell said without looking back. Yes, Jack replied quietly. It is. The door closed with a definitive click, and Jack was alone. He should feel worried. Should be calculating responses, shoring up support, preparing for the political battle that Mitchell would inevitably wage. Instead, he felt nothing but certainty. He'd made his choice. And he was done apologizing for it. His phone rang Roman's name on the screen. Mitchell just stormed past me, Roman said without preamble. He looked ready to commit murder. How bad? He's going to make a move, Jack said. Probably try to turn the mid-level distributors. Maybe reach out to our competitors. Position himself as the stable leadership option. And let him try, Jack said. We'll handle it. But Roman? No compromises on Hannah and Olivia. Whatever resources they need, whatever protection they require, it's non-negotiable. Silence on the line, then. Understood, boss. For what it's worth, I think you're making the right call. Why? Because the Jack Michel who'd walk past a kid asking for help isn't someone I'd want to work for, Roman said simply. And I think I'm not alone in that. They ended the call, and Jack looked out at the city, his city, the empire he'd built through ruthlessness and calculation. It looked the same as it always had, but something fundamental had shifted, and Jack knew his world would never be quite the same. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. When he opened it, he saw a photo of Olivia and Hannah in the hospital bed, both smiling despite the bruises and bandages. Beneath it, a message from Jennifer, the nurse. She wanted me to send this, said to tell Jack she's not scared anymore. Jack stared at the photo for a long moment. This captured instant of healing and hope. He forwarded it to Roman with a single line. This is what we're protecting now. Make sure everyone understands. Then he grabbed his coat and headed for the door. He had promises to keep, a future to plan, and a 5-year-old girl who needed to know that when someone said they'd come back, they meant it. The Empire could survive one more night without him. Olivia couldn't. And somewhere in the balance between those two truths, Jack Michel was learning what power really meant, not the ability to destroy, but the courage to protect, even when it cost everything. Thanks for staying with this story, right till the final moment. You're the reason these stories come alive. If you're ready for another powerful journey, just tap the next video on your screen. And before you go, leave a quick comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I'm excited to see your thoughts and connect with you down there.